The morning I understood everything, I was standing in a parking lot I'd been walking into since I was 4 years old, watching a stranger carry my father's cast iron skillet out the front door. I didn't shout. I didn't run toward him. I just stood there, with my keys in my hand, because my brain genuinely could not process what my eyes were seeing. "Excuse me," I finally said. "What are you doing?" The man barely looked up. "Moving the kitchen equipment out. You with the new owners?" I said the words slowly, like each one was made of glass. "There are no new owners. I am one of the owners." He stopped, looked at me, then looked back at a clipboard in his hand. "Ma'am, this property transferred title 11 days ago. We're contracted by Meridian Property Group." He said it like that should mean something to me. It didn't. Not yet. But I want you to stay with me here. Because to understand that parking lot moment, to understand why those words hit me like a physical blow, you need to understand what that building was, what it meant. And you need to understand my brother Daniel. And once you understand Daniel, everything else will make a horrible, perfect kind of sense. My parents came to this country with almost nothing. My father, Alexander, everyone called him Alex, arrived from Ukraine in the early 1980s with $40, one suitcase, and the ability to make a borscht that could make a grown man weep. My mother, Irina, followed him 8 months later. They met at a Ukrainian Orthodox church, married 6 months after that, and by 1989, they had saved enough to lease a small space in a strip mall in a mid-sized Ohio city that I won't name. Because honestly, some of those people still live there. The restaurant was called Sunflower, bright yellow sign, 12 tables, my mother's hand-embroidered tablecloths, my father's cooking, a chalkboard menu that my father updated himself every single morning in his particular slanted handwriting, because he said that a menu should be written by the person who was going to cook the food, not printed, written. By the time I was born, the third and youngest child, the surprise, the one my father called his autumn miracle, Sunflower had expanded twice, had a full catering operation, and was the kind of place that had a 6-month waiting list for Christmas bookings. My brother Daniel was the oldest, 8 years older than me. By the time I was in elementary school, he was already in high school, already big, then already confident in that specific way that fills up a room and makes everyone in it relax. Daniel was the one who could make my father beam with a single sentence. He was handsome, charming, and he had what my father called the presence. He could walk into Sunflower on a packed Saturday night, greet every table by name, compliment every woman on something specific and genuine, and have the whole room feeling like they'd been invited to a private party. My sister Marta was in the middle, 5 years older than me. She married early, moved to Vancouver, and was largely, and I say this with deep love, absent from most of what I'm about to tell you. So it was always, in a practical sense, just me and Daniel, and I adored him. I need you to understand that, because what comes later only makes sense through the lens of that adoration. Though I spent my childhood trailing after him through the restaurant kitchen, begging to help him with things the way little sisters do. He taught me chess at the kitchen table when I was 7. He sat in the front row of every one of my school plays and whooped embarrassingly loud. He drove 4 hours to see me graduate from college. When I was 22 years old, my father formally made us both co-owners of Sunflower. I remember that day so clearly. The 4 of us at the round table in the back of the restaurant, the table we called the family table, because it was never sold to customers and never would be. My father had a bottle of wine. He was 61 years old and had the hands of a man who had cooked every day of his adult life. He slid 2 envelopes across the table, one to Daniel, one to me. This restaurant is my life," he said, in his accented English. "But my children are my soul. I trust you both with this. Equal partners, equal say. You understand? Daniel placed his hand over my father's. Of course, Tato. I was already crying. I'm a crier. I've made my peace with it. What I didn't know, what none of us knew at that beautiful table with that bottle of wine, was that 11 years later, I would be standing in a parking lot, watching my father's cast iron skillet walk away in the arms of a stranger. And that the person who made that possible was sitting at home, right at that moment, with his hands wrapped around a cup of coffee, knowing exactly what I was about to discover. For the first 8 years of our partnership, things were genuinely good. Daniel ran the front of house, the events, the marketing, the customer relationships. He was brilliant at it. I had a business degree, and I handled the finances, catering bookings, vendor contracts, and staff scheduling. We had a rhythm. We argued sometimes, the way partners do, but we always came back to the table. I thought we always would. Then, about 3 years ago, my father was diagnosed with early-stage Parkinson's disease. Overnight, everything shifted. My father tried to stay on. For the first year, he could still cook, still walk the floor, still be Alex. But the tremors worsened. The exhaustion worsened. And what hurt most was watching him try to hide it. This man, who had been a mountain for 60 years, standing at his station and staring at his shaking hands like they belonged to someone else, trying to will them still through sheer stubbornness. Daniel and I sat down and agreed. I would absorb my father's day-to-day operational role, and Daniel would expand his responsibilities across events and staffing. It seemed reasonable. We were both stretched thin, but we were managing. But somewhere in those conversations, something shifted that I wouldn't notice for another full year. It started with the financial reports. Every month, I compiled a full profit and loss statement and emailed it to Daniel. Normally, he'd reply within a few days. Questions, pushback on certain line items, sometimes genuine disagreement. That was healthy, but around the time my father's illness progressed to the point of requiring full-time home care, Daniel stopped replying. I'd send the report. Nothing. I'd text him a week later. Hey, did you get this month's numbers? He'd text back. Yeah. All looks great. Talk soon. But we never talked. I told myself he was overwhelmed. His wife, Renata, had just had their second child. He was managing the floor and the events calendar while I was spending half my time at my parents' house. We were both carrying too much. I filled in the gap with the most charitable explanation available because I was already carrying grief and adding suspicion felt impossible. That's what grief does to you. I want you to hold on to that. It becomes important. Grief makes you generous with the people you love. It makes you overlook things you shouldn't overlook because you're already so full of hurt that there's no room left for doubt. So I told myself, he's stressed. He trusts me. The numbers are fine, but here's what I should have paid attention to. Not the missing replies. Something smaller. One Tuesday morning, I arrived at the restaurant at 7:30 to do inventory. Our accountant, a woman named Gloria, who'd worked with us for 6 years, was at her desk. When she heard me come through the door, she closed her laptop. Not dramatically, not theatrically, just quickly. A fraction of a second faster than the situation called for. She looked up and smiled. Morning, Elena. Didn't expect you today. Just doing inventory, I said. Of course, she said. Need any help? No, I'm good. I went to the back and did the inventory and thought nothing of it, but I noticed. Something in me noticed. I just didn't know yet what I had seen. My father moved into a full-time care facility in January of that year. He had fought it as long as he could, but his body had made the decision for him. My mother was in her early 70s, and she physically could no longer manage his care at home. The first time I visited him in the facility, he held my hand and asked, in a voice that was quieter than it used to be, You're watching over things, Lenochka? His name for me. Little Elena. Always Tato, I said. He squeezed my hand and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Daniel knows what he's doing. Don't fight with him. I frowned. We're not fighting. Good, he said. Stay that way. I thought nothing of it at the time. I thought he was just being a father. The universal instinct to smooth things over, to protect the family peace, especially when you know your time is limited. But I've thought about that moment hundreds of times since. Because what it tells me now is that my father was already uneasy. He had already felt something, he just didn't know how to name it, and perhaps he was afraid that naming it would break something that couldn't be repaired. Around February, Daniel began making significant staffing decisions without consulting me. He hired a new head chef, a woman named Priya, who came from a well-regarded restaurant in Columbus, without even mentioning it to me, until she had already started. I found out when I walked into the kitchen on a Monday, and there was a woman I had never seen working my father's station. I called Daniel immediately. I'd just met the new chef. Oh, Priya, she's incredible. Wait until you taste her lamb. Daniel, you hired her without telling me. A pause, then a voice that was warm and slightly amused. The voice of an older sibling being gently indulgent. Elena, the kitchen was struggling. We needed someone fast. I made a call. You're not actually upset about this, are you? We make calls together. We were going to discuss it this week. I just moved a little faster than I said I would. Come on, the restaurant needs this. I let it go. That was my first mistake. The first in a series of mistakes I've had to forgive myself for, slowly, over a very long time. 3 weeks later, I was at the restaurant late, after closing, going through vendor invoices. We had a new produce vendor Daniel had switched us to without consulting me. I was matching invoices to bank statements, standard practice, and I came across a payment to a company called Cardinal Services, LLC for $3,400. I didn't recognize the name. I went through every invoice in my files, nothing from Cardinal Services. I searched our expense tracking software. Cardinal Services, LLC had been receiving $3,400 every single month for the past 8 months. That was $27,200. I had never approved this expense. I had never even seen an invoice for it. I texted Daniel, "Hey, what's Cardinal Services, LLC?" He replied 20 minutes later, "Consulting, new marketing strategy. Talk to you about this." I stared at that text for a long time. He had not talked to me about this. I wrote back, "Can you send me the contract and invoices?" He replied, "Sure, we'll dig them up." He never sent them. I want you to hold that name, Cardinal Services, LLC. Hold the question of what it is and who it belongs to, because the answer, when it finally arrives, is going to shift everything you think you know about this story. My father passed away on a Thursday morning in April. I'm not going to rush through that because it deserves more than a sentence. He died quietly, in his sleep. The nurses told us it was peaceful. My mother had been with him the night before. Daniel had visited the previous weekend. I had been there on Tuesday. I'd read to him from a book of Ukrainian poetry he had always loved, and he had slept through most of it, his breathing slow and even, but at one point he opened his eyes and looked at me and said, "You have your grandmother's voice." I think about that every single day. The funeral was on a Saturday. The entire Ukrainian community came. The restaurant community came. Suppliers, customers going back 30 years, people who had come to Sunflower for their first dates, their anniversary dinners, or their children's baptism parties. My father was, in the truest and most complete sense of the phrase, beloved. The reception was held at Sunflower, of course. All the tables pushed together into one long surface, my mother's tablecloths everywhere, food that people had brought from their own kitchens, because that is what you do in this community. And I was standing with a glass of water. I wasn't drinking, watching the room, when I looked across and found my brother. He was talking to a man I didn't recognize. A man in a very good suit. Too good for a funeral in our community. The kind of suit that says, City Money. They were standing near the front window, slightly apart from the crowd. Phi and Daniel was leaning toward him with his shoulders relaxed and an expression on his face that I recognized because I had seen it 1,000 times at the restaurant. It was his closing expression, the one he wore when he was about to shake hands on a deal. And then they shook hands. At my father's funeral reception, while my mother was in the other room accepting condolences. The man smiled and moved toward the exit. Daniel turned back toward the room, and his eyes swept over the guests and landed briefly on me, and he smiled the way you smile when you've accomplished something. I told myself I had misread it, that maybe the man was an old friend, that grief was making me paranoid, but I couldn't stop seeing that smile. Who was that man in the good suit? What had they agreed on? 2 weeks after the funeral, Daniel called me and suggested we hold a formal partnership review, a structured meeting to assess where the restaurant stood and plan the year ahead. He was warm, engaged, energetic. He talked about expansion, a second location, a larger catering division, honoring our father's legacy by growing what he'd built. I was so relieved I almost cried again. We met at the restaurant on a Sunday before opening. Daniel brought coffee and pastries from a bakery Renata liked. I brought my laptop with 3 years of financials. For 2 hours, we talked about the future with real excitement, the way we used to talk early in the partnership when everything felt like possibility. At the end of the meeting, as we were packing up, Daniel mentioned almost as an aside, I've set up a digital signature portal, DocuSign style, so we can execute contracts and vendor agreements faster. No more chasing physical paperwork. I'll send you the login tonight. Sure, I said. He sent it that evening. I set up my account, clicked through the terms, started using the platform. I did not read the full terms of the authorization agreement when I activated my account. I want to be very honest about that because it matters. I clicked past it the way most of us click past things we assume are standard boilerplate. 6 pages. I skimmed, I signed. I should have read every word. I should always have read every word. Over the next 2 months, things felt almost normal. Almost. But there were small, quiet moments that I kept adding to an unsorted pile in the back of my mind. Our restaurant manager, a man named Pete, who had worked for us for 9 years, who knew the restaurant as well as anyone, left suddenly. Daniel told me Pete had found a better opportunity elsewhere. I texted Pete to congratulate him. He never replied. I thought that was odd. Pete and I had always been close. He'd been at my father's funeral, had hugged my mother. A few weeks later, I ran into his wife at the grocery store. She seemed uncomfortable the moment she saw me. "How's Pete doing?" I asked. "He's okay," she said. "He misses the place. It all happened so fast." "He'll land somewhere great," I said. She gave me a look I couldn't quite read. "I assumed you knew the details." "About what?" Her phone rang. She answered it, gave me a quick, apologetic wave, and walked away. What details? Then came the passwords. One morning, I tried to log into our accounting software and received an error message. Invalid credentials. I called Daniel. He told me there had been a security update and that it would be sorted within a few days. 3 weeks later, nothing had changed, so I called Gloria directly. She was quiet for a moment before answering. Daniel asked me to consolidate administrative access to reduce security risks. He has the master login. You'd need to go through him for account access. I took a breath. "Gloria, I'm a co-owner of this restaurant." "I know," she said. And in her voice, underneath the professional distance, underneath the carefully neutral tone, There was something that sounded, if I wasn't imagining things, like an apology. That evening, I drove to my mother's house for dinner. My mother had made borscht, vareniki, punta and a honey cake for just the two of us, which in our family's language meant something is wrong and I am coping through food. Midway through dinner, without looking up from her plate, my mother said quietly, "Daniel says you've been very stressed since Tato died. He's worried about you." Something in my chest went still. "Does he?" I said. "He says maybe you need some time away, that you shouldn't have to carry the weight of the restaurant right now, that he can handle things while you rest." She finally looked up at me. "He mentioned that you've been making some poor decisions at work, being emotional. He said it kindly, Lenochka. He just worries." I did not argue with my mother. I didn't want to put her in the middle of something she didn't yet understand. But as I drove home that night, one phrase ran on repeat in my head. On poor decisions at work. I hadn't made any decisions. I had been locked out of the system. Why was my brother telling our grieving mother that I was becoming unstable? I need to tell you something about myself before this next part. I'm not a dramatic person. I don't invent problems or catastrophize. My entire career has been built on the ability to look at numbers and find the exact truth inside them. So, when I tell you what I discovered, I need you to understand that every part of me resisted the conclusion I was being forced toward. I hired an outside forensic accountant, a woman named Diane, who I found through a lawyer contact, and who I asked to do an unofficial preliminary review, just to understand what I was looking at. To do this, I needed records I'd been locked out of. But here's what Daniel had forgotten. 2 years earlier, before any of this, I had quietly set up a read-only cloud backup of all restaurant financial records that automatically synced to a private folder I controlled. I'd set it up for disaster recovery purposes, mentioned it to no one, and then, honestly, largely forgotten about it. That backup had never stopped running. I downloaded everything and handed it to Diane. She spent 3 weeks going through it. When she called me to give her preliminary findings, she asked me to sit down first. I was already sitting. I sat down harder. Over 19 months, approximately $340,000 had been drained from the restaurant through a combination of phantom expenses, inflated vendor contracts, and payments to companies that existed only as names in a filing database. Chit Cardinal Services, LLC, was one of 4 shell companies receiving regular payments. The others were registered in Delaware and Nevada, with no online presence, no staff, and no identifiable services. $340,000. Gone. The restaurant wasn't in financial trouble because of market conditions or pandemic recovery. The restaurant had been systematically and deliberately drained. And then Diane said, "There's something else. I need you to look at a specific transaction from 6 weeks ago." She sent a document to my email. I opened it. It was a deed transfer. Sunflower Restaurant, the building, the property, the equipment, all of it, had been transferred to a holding company called Meridian Property Group for $1.1 million. My signature was on the deed, and my hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone. "That's not my signature," I said. "I know," Diane said quietly, "but here's the thing. Here's the thing that makes this more sophisticated than a simple forgery." I went back and found the email Daniel sent me the night of our partnership review. I found the DocuSign platform authorization agreement. Buried in paragraph 14 of 6 pages of boilerplate, there was a clause granting electronic signature authority to the designated account administrator for all subsequent transactions executed on behalf of the business partnership. The designated account administrator was Daniel. He hadn't needed to forge my signature. He had spent 2 hours over coffee and pastries convincing me to sign over the legal authority to sign for me. And I had handed it to him because I was relieved that my brother still felt like my brother, and because I didn't read the fine print. I hired a real lawyer. A woman named Patricia, who specialized in business fraud. She reviewed everything and called me back within 48 hours. The shell companies, she said, Cardinal Services, North Point Consulting, Apex Ventures, Redwood Management. My researcher looked into these. Are you ready? Yes, I said. Cardinal Services, LLC was registered to a Renata Kovach-Howell, my sister-in-law, Daniel's wife. I don't know why it surprised me. I had told you this story would make a horrible, perfect kind of sense, and here it was. My brother and his wife had been paying themselves through a company in Renata's name, a company that provided no actual services, using funds from a partnership that included the restaurant my father had built with $40. But Patricia wasn't finished. The man in the good suit at the funeral reception, she said. You mentioned him. I had described him almost offhandedly during our first meeting. I hadn't expected her to find him. His name is Gregory Tesler. He's the principal of Meridian Property Group. I sat with that for a moment. The man Daniel had shaken hands with at my father's funeral reception, while my mother was accepting condolences 30 feet away, was the buyer. He had been planning the sale while my father's body was still warm. That same week, my mother's neighbor called me. Her name was Vera. She was in her late 70s, had known my family since we arrived in this country, and when I heard her voice on the phone, she sounded like someone who had been carrying something too heavy and needed to put it down. I met her at a coffee shop 2 blocks from my mother's house. She clasped my hands across the table before she said a word. I'm going to tell you something because I believe you need to know it. And because I believe your father would want you to know. She told me that about 4 weeks before my father died, a lawyer had come to the care facility Daniel had brought him. Daniel said my father needed to update his will while he was still of sound mind. Standard practice, nothing alarming. My mother had been present initially, then asked to step out during part of the signing. She felt uneasy about it. But Daniel told her it was standard procedure. Your mother mentioned it to her own doctor afterward, Vera said. He was concerned enough to make a note of it. I went directly from that coffee shop to my father's original estate lawyer, a man named Howard who had drafted the first will 12 years earlier. He pulled the file. Original will. Equal shares between Daniel and Elena. Marta to receive the family home and a lump sum. Updated will. Filed 6 weeks before my father died. Daniel to receive controlling operational interest in the restaurant. Elena to receive a buyout at fair market value to be determined by independent appraisal. Howard had not drafted this revised will. A different lawyer had. A man named Brendan Walsh. I looked up Brendan Walsh that evening. He and Daniel had been college roommates. Patricia called me 2 days later with what seemed, briefly, beautifully, like good news. A title examiner she worked with had flagged a technical problem with the property transfer to Meridian. Ohio law has specific requirements for real property transactions that a blanket digital authorization agreement might not satisfy. The transfer could potentially be voidable. For 3 days, I allowed myself to feel hope. Real, physical, warming hope. I started believing we could get the restaurant back. That Daniel would face consequences. That this nightmare had a ceiling. Then Patricia called on the 4th day. Daniel's lawyer had filed a preemptive complaint with the Secretary of State's office, alleging that I had abandoned my ownership interest and breached my fiduciary duty as a partner. He claimed I'd been present at a formal partnership dissolution meeting in January where I had agreed to the dissolution and signed the documentation. That's impossible, I said. I was never at any such meeting. I know, Patricia said, but he has a signed attendance log. 2 days later, a settlement offer arrived. $85,000 in exchange for a full release of all claims against Daniel, Renata, and the partnership. $85,000 for $1 million property and $340,000 in stolen funds for my father's life work, for 40 years of my family's history. Patricia sat across from me and told me gently that given the complexity of the situation, the cost of litigation, the challenges of proving fraud, and the injunction now preventing us from accessing business records, a settlement might be the pragmatic choice. I looked at her for a long moment. "No," I said. She nodded slowly, and her eyes said she'd hoped I would say that. "Then we need to find something definitive. It got worse before it got better. I need to be honest with you about that." Daniel called my mother and told her I was planning to destroy the family, that I'd hired lawyers to sue him, that I would drag the family name through the newspapers, that our father, his voice cracked, my mother told me, would be heartbroken. My mother called me crying. "Lenochka, what is happening? Why are you doing this to your brother?" "Mama, Daniel stole from the restaurant. He forged documents. He manipulated Tato's will." "Daniel says you're not well?" "He says the grief has affected your thinking." He said he spoke with a doctor who told him that sometimes after trauma, a person can... Mama. I had to stop. I had to breathe through the tightening in my chest. I am not unwell. Please, listen to me. But she was crying, and I was crying, and between us was my brother's very deliberate, very precise version of reality, placed there like a wall, one careful conversation at a time. A week after that, I received a certified letter from a law firm I didn't recognize. Inside was a demand letter alleging defamation, citing my conversations with Vera, with Diane, with Patricia, and threatening a $500,000 lawsuit unless I signed a non-disparagement agreement within 10 days. I sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for a full hour after reading that letter. I'm not going to pretend. That was the hour I came closest to giving up, to taking the $85,000 and signing the release and letting all of it go. My father was dead. The restaurant was gone. My mother thought I was losing my mind. My brother, who I had loved my entire life, was now using the legal system to silence me. What do you hold on to in a moment like that? I held on to the cast iron skillet. That skillet had been in my father's kitchen since before I was born. He used it every day. He had a specific way of cleaning it. No soap, always oil. Treat it like a living thing. When his hand shook too badly to lift it in the final months, he had held it one last time and said, "This skillet has made 1,000 meals. You take care of it." Someone had carried it out the front door. In my car, in that parking lot, I said out loud to no one, "I am not taking $85,000. I am getting back everything that was taken. I want to walk you through the next 6 weeks carefully, not because every step matters." The first thing I did, I returned to the cloud backup. The read-only archive that had been quietly running for 2 years, syncing every financial record to a private folder Daniel didn't know existed. I downloaded everything, 3 years of transactions, vendor correspondence, payroll records, internal communications, and gave Diane a complete copy for full forensic analysis. The second thing I did, I found Pete. I tracked him down through a mutual contact and asked if he'd meet me for coffee. He agreed, but chose a diner 20 minutes from where either of us lived. He arrived looking like a man who hadn't fully exhaled in months. He talked for an hour. Pete had been fired, not resigned. Daniel had called him in one morning, told him that financial irregularities had been discovered in a department Pete oversaw, and that it was in everyone's best interest if Pete quietly resigned in exchange for a generous severance. Pete, with a wife, 2 kids and a mortgage, had taken the severance. He had spent months believing he'd missed something, failed somehow. There was a woman who came in about 3 months before all this, Pete told me. She started going through old files. Priya was with her. They spent a full Saturday in the back office. When I asked Daniel what was happening, he said it was a compliance review. "What do you think it really was?" I asked. He looked at me. "I think they were destroying things they didn't want found." Pete agreed to write a formal statement. The third thing I did. I hired a private investigator. A former county sheriff's investigator named Carl, who was, in the best possible way, methodical and thorough. I asked Carl to investigate 2 things: the nature of Renata's involvement with Cardinal Services and the background of Brendan Walsh, the lawyer who had drafted the revised will. Carl came back to me in 3 weeks. Renata's phone records, obtained through filings connected to the business registration, showed no calls that could be reasonably attributed to marketing consulting work. What they did show were regular calls to a storage facility in a suburb of our city, a unit in her name. Patricia sent a formal legal letter to the facility citing my rights as a co-owner of the business. The manager allowed her office to document the contents, and what was inside that storage unit would change everything. 40 years of my father's restaurant records. Paper files going back to the 1980s. The original lease agreements, his recipe books. His handwritten development notes on dishes he never finished creating. Everything that documented what Sunflower had been. And in the back of a filing cabinet, in a folder marked simply Insurance, something else entirely. A second file on the will revision, not just the documents. Drafting notes, email communications between Daniel and Brendan Walsh from 3 months before my father died. 3 months before anyone could reasonably claim his final wishes had spontaneously changed. Walsh's email asking whether they needed a neutral witness. Daniel's reply, "Just bring the standard witnesses. He won't argue. He trusts me." He won't argue. He trusts me. I read that sentence in the parking lot of a storage facility, sitting on the asphalt with the printout in my hands, and I thought about my father at the family table with the bottle of wine and the 2 envelopes and the words, "My children are my soul." He trusted you. He trusted you completely. And you used it. Carl also confirmed what part of me had been half knowing and half refusing to know about Priya. She and Daniel had been in a relationship before she was ever hired. He hadn't recruited her for her culinary skills alone. He had needed someone inside the kitchen who was loyal to him, someone who would be present when things needed to be managed and absent when questions were being asked. She had been in that back office on the Saturday. Pete saw them. Not a compliance review, a document purge. But Priya, it turned out, had kept copies. I don't know fully why. Insurance, maybe? Or perhaps she had looked at what she was part of and needed an exit. Whatever the reason, she had photographed documents before destroying them, and those photographs were saved to a cloud folder connected to the restaurant's email system, a system I still had access to because Daniel had overlooked it when he changed the passwords. Patricia looked at those documents and called me within the hour. "Elena," she said, "we have more than enough." And then there was the dissolution meeting. The January meeting Daniel claimed I had attended and signed off on. His lawyer was extremely confident about this document. He had no reason to be, because I had attended a 2-day hospitality business conference in Pittsburgh that exact weekend. Hotel receipts, conference registration documentation. A keynote photograph I appeared in. 2 colleagues who had texted me throughout both days. An ironclad, complete, and unambiguous alibi for a meeting I had never set foot in. The attendance log had a forged signature, and we could prove it. When Patricia presented this to Daniel's lawyer, he requested a 2-week delay to review the situation with his client, Within 48 hours, he withdrew from the case entirely. My mother's 74th birthday was in September. A Sunday. The whole family came, Daniel and Renata and their children, Marta and her husband from Vancouver, cousins, longtime friends. My mother had been cooking for 2 days. I had debated with Patricia and with myself whether to do this here. Part of me said, wait, do it in a courtroom, through lawyers, on the record, park in the proper setting. But then I thought about my mother. About the months of whispered conversations in which she had been told her youngest daughter was unstable. About the way she had looked at me across the dinner table with worry and love and confusion, all mixed together. She deserved to hear the truth from my mouth, not from a legal brief. I arrived an hour before the guests. I sat with her at her kitchen table and I told her everything. Quietly, calmly. I laid the documentation out, the shell companies, the emails, the storage unit, the forged meeting, the will. My mother sat with her hands folded and became very, very still. The specific stillness she enters when something has cracked open inside her, but she will not let herself break apart yet. When I finished, she was quiet for a long time. "He told me you were unwell," she finally said. "I know." "He told me you were making accusations because of grief, because you weren't thinking clearly." "I know." She looked at the kitchen door for a moment. "Your father knew." I looked at her. Not everything, but he felt something. He told me, maybe a month before he died, he said, "Irina, watch Elena, watch out for her." I didn't understand why. A long pause. I think I understand now. When Daniel arrived with Renata and the children, he walked into a living room full of cousins and laughter and my mother's record player and saw me standing there. His face did something fast and complicated before settling into that practiced, comfortable smile. "Lena, you made it." As if he'd been wondering, as if we hadn't been navigating lawyers and injunctions for months. "Oh, Daniel," I said, "can we talk in the kitchen for a minute?" He looked around the room, touched Renata's arm, smiled at a cousin. "Of course." In the kitchen, just me, Daniel, Renata. My mother standing in the doorway, which Daniel had not expected. I set a folder on the table. "I know about Cardinal Services," I said. "I know about North Point, Apex, and Redwood. I know about the storage unit. I know about the will change and the emails between you and Brendan Walsh. I know about the January meeting I wasn't at. I know about Gregory Tesler and Meridian Property Group." I paused. "And I know you shook his hand at Tato's funeral." Renata went pale, completely, immediately pale. Daniel stared at the folder. He did not open it. He knew what was in it. "This is family," he said finally. His voice was level, controlled. Whatever you think you have, this is family. You want to tear apart this family?" "You tore it apart," I said. "I'm just showing everyone what you did." "Elena." His voice shifted, softer now, older, the voice of the brother who taught me chess and sat in the front row at every school play. "You're upset. I understand. Things got complicated. I made some decisions that You stole $340,000, I said. "You coached a lawyer to manipulate our dying father into revising his will. You transferred our family's restaurant with a fraudulent authorization. You told our mother I was mentally unstable to stop her from believing me. You fired Pete to protect yourself, and you had someone destroy evidence." The kitchen was quiet in a way that felt dense and heavy. Renata was the first to speak. "I want a lawyer," she said. Daniel looked at her, then back at me. I watched him, the man who had always known what to say in every room he walked into, and I watched him run out of words. "This doesn't have to go any further," he said. "It already has," I said. Patricia filed the fraud complaint with the county prosecutor's office on Friday. That landed. That was the moment. I watched the calculation leave his face. replaced by something smaller and more honest than anything I'd seen from him in years. From the living room, I could hear cousins talking and children laughing and my mother's record player. Something Ukrainian, slow and old. My father had loved this particular song. He used to hum it while he cooked. "Tato trusted you," I said. "He said you knew what you were doing." He said, "Don't fight with Daniel." Well, he trusted you right until the end. Daniel said nothing. "I'm going back to the party," I said. "Your children are in the next room, and I'm not going to ruin their grandmother's birthday. But you should know that the legal process is already moving. Patricia will be in touch with your new lawyer." I picked up the folder and walked back into the living room. The legal process took 14 months. Daniel and Renata's lawyers tried to fight everything initially, but the evidence was extensive, the Pittsburgh alibi was incontrovertible, and the withdrawal of Daniel's original lawyer had already told everyone paying attention that the defense had structural problems it couldn't solve. The shell company payments were prosecuted as wire fraud and embezzlement. Daniel pleaded guilty to reduced charges in exchange for a full repayment agreement, the $340,000 plus interest and legal costs to come from his personal assets and a portion of the property sale proceeds. The property transfer itself was more complex. Meridian Property Group had not acted in bad faith. Gregory Tesler had dealt with Daniel as the apparent authorized representative of the partnership, and the electronic authorization agreement, while ethically fraudulent, was sophisticated enough to have misled a reasonable commercial party. However, the court found that the authorization had been obtained through material misrepresentation, rendering the transaction voidable. Rather than engage in a protracted legal battle with a questionable outcome, Meridian negotiated a settlement. The property transferred to a new holding company Patricia helped me structure, and Meridian received partial reimbursement from Daniel's repayment fund. We didn't get the restaurant back the way it had been. The kitchen had been gutted, the equipment sold off. The building needed real renovation. But we got the building. The will revision was successfully challenged. The court found the revision had been executed under conditions suggesting undue influence, supported by Walsh's emails and the fact that my father had been administered increased pain medication in the week before signing. Walsh surrendered his law license in a separate disciplinary proceeding. Priya cooperated fully with investigators in exchange for immunity. She provided every document she had photographed and kept. I don't know exactly what she felt about all of it. I hope the fact that she saved those copies means some part of her, even then, in the middle of it, knew that what was happening was wrong. Daniel and Renata divorced before his sentencing. I don't say that with any satisfaction. Their children are my nephews and my niece. They didn't choose any of this. That door stays open, as best as I can manage. It isn't easy. Some days it isn't possible. But I keep trying. Daniel served 18 months of supervised probation. He lost his portion of the inheritance. He lost his marriage. He lost the reputation he had spent 30 years building. The room-filling charm, the name everyone knew, the man who made every table feel like a private party. I drove past him at a gas station 6 months after the sentencing. He looked like a man who had been carrying something very heavy for a very long time, and had finally, miserably, been forced to put it down. I don't hate him. I've sat with that for a long time, turned it over. I genuinely don't hate him. Hate requires you to keep thinking about a person, and I have a restaurant to run. Sunflower reopened on a Friday evening in early spring. We kept the name. We kept the yellow sign. New sign, same yellow. My mother's embroidered tablecloths. The family table in the back, still not for sale, never for sale. We hired a new chef, a woman named Helena, who had cooked for 20 years at a Ukrainian restaurant in Cleveland and who had hands that reminded me of my father's. On opening night, there was a line out the door. Some of those people had been coming to this restaurant since before I was born. A man named Borislav arrived at 6 o'clock and sat at the same table he had sat at for 32 years. He ordered the borscht. When Helena brought it out, he tasted it slowly, the way he always had, and nodded. "Close enough," he said. That is the highest possible compliment a 70-year-old Ukrainian man can give. I stood near the kitchen door and watched the room fill with noise and warmth and the smell of food. And I thought about something I keep returning to when people ask me how I got through all of it. The answer is embarrassingly simple. I paid attention. Not at first. Grief had made me generous with the people I loved most, and my brother had exploited that generosity with real precision. But eventually, I paid attention. To Gloria closing her laptop a fraction of a second too fast. To Pete's wife's uncomfortable glance. To a handshake at a funeral that had no business being a handshake. To a text message that said, "We'll dig them up," and never dug them up. To the quiet, persistent feeling that something was off. Not dramatic, not obvious, just quietly, consistently off. Your instincts are not paranoia. Paranoia invents threats. Instinct detects them. If there is something in your life that feels wrong, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly and persistently wrong, do not explain it away with generosity. Follow it. Ask the question. Check the backup. My father came to this country with $40. He built something. And here's what I understand now about what he built. It was never a restaurant. The restaurant was just the shape it happened to take. What my father actually built was a place where people came back, where they brought their children and then their grandchildren, where a man named Borislav sat at the same table for 32 years. You can't steal that. A building can be transferred, a deed can be forged, a will can be revised by a man who was trusted too much. Passwords can be changed, and records can be destroyed, and a daughter can be told she is losing her mind. But you cannot steal what a life, lived honestly and with love, leaves behind. It was here before any of this happened. It's here now. My name is Elena, and my father's restaurant is open.